Imagine waking up one morning, and by the end of the week, a third of everyone you know is dead. Not sick, not dying, dead. Your neighbor, the baker, the priest who gave last rites to your father, the children who played outside your window yesterday morning, and you have no idea why. No germ theory, no microscope, no doctor who can explain what is happening or when it will stop. Just bodies everywhere, faster than they can be buried, in the sound of cartwheels on cobblestones at night, in a voice calling out words you will hear in your nightmares for the rest of your life. Between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death killed somewhere between 75 and 200 million people across Eurasia. In Europe alone, it erased roughly a third of the entire population. Some regions lost half, some cities lost more. And yet, people survived, not just a few, millions of them. They made decisions, developed strategies, and found ways to keep themselves and the people they loved alive in the middle of the worst biological catastrophe in recorded human history. Here is how they did it. And here is how much of it, without knowing a single thing about bacteria, actually worked. The plague arrived in Europe in October 1347, when 12 Genoese trading ships docked at the Sicilian port of Messina. The sailors on board were already dying. They had black swellings the size of eggs in their armpits and groins, oozing blood and pus. Their skin was covered in dark blotches. They were burning with fever and delirious with pain. Port authorities ordered the ships back out to sea immediately. It was already too late. Within weeks, the disease was spreading through Sicily. Within months, it had reached the Italian mainland. By 1348, it was moving through France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. By 1350, England. By 1350, Scandinavia. It moved along trade routes, following merchants and soldiers and pilgrims, jumping from city to city with terrifying speed. Medieval people had no concept of contagion in the modern sense. They did not know about bacteria. They did not know that Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague, was being carried by fleas living on rats, and that as the rats died in enormous numbers, the fleas were jumping to the nearest available warm body, which was usually a human being. They did not know any of this, but they noticed something. They noticed that the disease seemed to spread between people, that it moved through households, that those who cared for the sick tended to become sick themselves. And so they did something that had no name yet, no formal theory, no scientific framework behind it. They ran. The wealthy fled first, out of the cities, into country estates, away from the crowded streets where the bodies were piling up. Giovanni Boccaccio, who survived the plague in Florence and wrote about it in the Decaron, described the noble families who locked themselves in country villas, ate well, drank wine, and refused all contact with the outside world. He also noted with some bitterness that the poor had nowhere to run. But even the poor adapted. Within months of the plague's arrival, communities across Europe were developing their own quarantine practices. Plague-stricken households were sealed, their doors were marked, people avoided the sick with a ruthlessness that contemporaries found shocking. Boccaccio wrote that parents abandoned children, children abandoned parents, spouses fled from dying spouses. It sounds like cowardice. It was, in many cases, survival. Epidemiologists studying the Black Death have found that communities which imposed strict isolation of the sick, even without understanding why, had significantly lower death rates than those that did not. The medieval instinct to separate, to flee, to refuse contact was biologically correct. They had arrived at a functional version of quarantine through observation alone, centuries before anyone understood what they were actually doing. But not everyone ran, and not everyone survived by running. Some cities took a different approach entirely. In 1348, the Republic of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik on the Adriatic coast, issued what is now considered one of the first formal quarantine laws in history. Ships arriving from plague-affected regions were required to anchor offshore for 30 days before anyone could disembark. The period was later extended to 40 days, which is where the word quarantine itself comes from the Italian quarantina, meaning 40. It worked. Ragusa survived the Black Death significantly better than many of its neighbors. Other cities fumbled towards similar solutions. In Milan, when plague appeared in a household, the authorities walled it shut with the sick and the healthy inside together. This was brutal, arguably monstrous. It was also effective at stopping the spread beyond those walls. Milan had one of the lowest death rates of any major Italian city during the epidemic. What neither Ragusa nor Milan understood was the mechanism. They were stopping human-to-human transmission of pneumonic plague, the lung-infecting variant that spread through the air, but they had no awareness of the flea and rat transmission chain driving the bubonic form. They were right for the wrong reasons, and they saved thousands of lives. Beyond quarantine, medieval people developed other strategies with varying degrees of success. Fire was used constantly. The belongings of the dead were burned. Houses where plague victims had died were fumigated with smoke. Cities burned enormous bonfires in public squares, believing that smoke purified the air. They were wrong about the mechanism. Bad air, or miasma, was their theory, not bacterial infection. But burning the possessions of the dead and fumigating living spaces destroyed fleas and flea eggs. Again, accidentally correct. Herbs were burned and carried, posies of flowers and aromatic plants held to the nose to block the miasma. The nursery rhyme survives, ring around the rosy, a pocket full of posies. Wrong theory, useless as medicine, but the behavior of holding herbs to the face while moving through infected areas may have provided marginal protection by filtering air in pneumonic plague zones. And then there was the group that got it most right, entirely by accident. The flagellants, wandering groups of men who traveled from town to town flogging themselves publicly as penance, believing the plague was God's punishment for human sin, were, medically speaking, doing almost everything wrong. They were gathering in large crowds, they were moving between cities, they were almost certainly spreading the disease. But some communities, watching the flagellants arrive, refused to let them in, slammed the gates, turned them away, not because they understood contagion, but because they were afraid of strangers carrying death. Those communities survived at higher rates. Fear, in the absence of knowledge, was doing the work that knowledge would later do with precision.
But survival was not only physical, and this is the part that the history books underplay. The Black Death did not just kill people, it dismantled the psychological architecture of an entire civilization. The Church, the institution that provided medieval Europeans with their entire framework for understanding suffering, death, and meaning, was catastrophically overwhelmed. Priests died faster than they could be replaced. Last rites went unperformed. The dying lay in the streets without sacrament, which in medieval Catholic theology meant their souls were in grave danger. The institution that was supposed to explain why terrible things happened had no explanation. God's punishment for sin was the official position, but children were dying, nuns were dying, the most devout communities were being wiped out alongside the most sinful. People noticed the inconsistency. What emerged from the Black Death was not atheism. The medieval mind was not built for that. What emerged was something stranger and more durable, a culture obsessed with death, intimate with it, almost comfortable with it in the way that only people who have looked directly at something terrible for long enough can become. The dance of death, the danse macabre, became one of the dominant artistic motifs of the late medieval period. Paintings, woodcuts, and sculptures depicted death as a dancing skeleton leading people of every rank, pope, emperor, peasant, child, in an endless procession. The message was not despair, it was equalizing. Death comes for the powerful and the powerless alike. Live accordingly. Communities that survived did so partly because they held together. The historical record, wills, court documents, letters, shows that in the aftermath of the worst outbreaks, survivors rebuilt with extraordinary speed. They remarried, they repopulated, they took over the land of those who had died. They raised wages because labor was suddenly scarce, and the lords who tried to hold the old rates found that their workers simply left. The Black Death killed a third of Europe. It also broke the feudal system. The survivors had leverage they had never had before, and they used it. They did not call it resilience. They did not have that word. They just kept going, the way people always have, in the only direction available. Forward. You are living through an era that has its own pandemics, its own moments of collective fear, its own experience of watching the numbers climb and wondering when it will stop. Medieval people had none of the tools you have. No virology, no vaccines, no understanding of how disease actually moves through a population. They were reasoning from observation, from fear, from theology, and from instinct. And they were, often, correct. Not because they were brilliant, but because they were paying attention. Because survival has a way of teaching the right lessons even when it cannot explain them. They did not know what a bacterium was. They knew to run from the sick. They knew to burn the belongings of the dead. They knew to close the gates to strangers bearing bad news. The science came later. The instinct was always there. It has always been there, in every generation that made it through something that should have ended them, including this one.